This isn't what I thought death would feel like. The world below was the same as always. It was clear and windless with a thin layer of clouds as far as the eye could see. Gawain Gao contemplated the endless stretch of land quietly, mulling over his life in silence. After all, there was nothing else he could do anyway. He could no longer remember how long he had been like this anymore. He did not even know what he looked like right now. Although he could roughly estimate time based on the alternations of day and night, he could not be bothered to keep track of it after 100,000 iterations of it. Is this what happens when I die? Am I being reincarnated? To be honest, Gawain was pretty open-minded about this whole afterlife thing. It was not that he was so enlightened that he thought of life and death as nothing. He realized that life and death were impermanent things. Fortunately, it was a realization he had before the airplane crashed down from the sky. Time had ceased to feel the same way as it had back on Earth. From his perspective, he had been in between for 1,000 years, as well as a few minutes. Both cases were true. Gawain did not know what condition he was in right now. He was unable to move his gaze, nor could he feel his body. In fact, he had lost all of his senses, except for his sight. Thus, he did not know if he was a wisp of his remnant soul, or a corpse orbiting in space. But there was one thing he was certain about. He was no longer what could feasibly be described as a human being. He did not think he could retain such clear thoughts and intact memories if he had the mental structure of a human consciousness while he floated adrift in the sky after hundreds of thousands of years. And he could even spare the effort to ponder about the meaning of life. A normal person would have succumbed to insanity a long time ago. Not Gawain. His mind was sharper than ever. The sands of time had not eroded Gawain's memories at all. Even now, he could distinctly remember the things that had happened to him in his last moments of life. The piercing screams, the alarms, the violently shaking plane, the rolling world outside the porthole, his neighbor failing to put on their oxygen mask, and the deafening sound the plane made as it disintegrated in mid-air. These images were crystal clear, as though the event had only happened the day before. He could also remember vividly how stunned he had felt when he reopened his eyes after that thundering noise and found himself adrift and orbiting this strange planet. From the moment he reopened his eyes, he knew that the continents and oceans he was seeing were not of planet Earth. Consequently, he used a little time to understand and accept the reality that he was in a foreign world now, and used a longer bit of time to figure out how he could stop floating. It was with much regret that he could not succeed in the second objective. He found that he was stuck, or rather, that his current form could not move. He had become a being that was locked in and could only look down at the world from a fixed angle. Sure, he could observe the planet, but that was the only thing he could do. It was impossible for him to look to the left or right, so he could not determine if there were any other landforms in the ocean. It was also for that same reason why he had not been able to catch a glimpse of the stars in this world until this day. He was not even certain if this world had other celestial bodies. Perhaps if he turned his head, he would be able to see a white-bearded god holding up a flashlight that shone on all matter, or something like that. Gawain wished he could flip on his back, if only to see if he could catch some sort of god looking unawares. However, everything was just a wild wish. Changing his viewing angle of the world was out of the question. Despite that, Gawain found that he could work with this perspective, after putting in effort for a long time. Even though he could not look left or right, he could zoom in or out of his field of vision, or rather pull and push his angle of view. After making this discovery, he had been euphoric for a prolonged period of time, and then tried out various zooming levels on his sight. Even though he was not able to see anything outside of that circle of ocean at the maximum he could zoom out, he could at least choose to zoom in on whatever he wanted to see on that piece of land. It was lush and vibrant, obviously teeming with life. Well, it would be nice if he could scrutinize the daily lives of these pseudo-Earth people. Even though he could only float up here, it would probably take away some of his boredom if he could observe the strange people's local culture and customs. He had then zoomed in as close as he could, until he could see all the grasses and trees on the land clearly. On that day, he had despaired as he found that none of the mammals on the planet had learned how to walk on their feet yet. But it was all right. Gawain had plenty of patience. He might have had a limit while he had still been human, but he discovered that from up here. He was in no rush. He could wait forever. He observed the monkeys learning how to walk upright. And then, after many, many years, he personally witnessed the discovery of fire by the first human. It had been sparked from flint. After the ignition of the first fire, Gawain felt everything speed up. Or rather, the way he felt the passage of time became muddled as the events on the land bloomed rapidly, as though he was watching a video that was being played on fast forward. He witnessed the humanoids swiftly building their first primitive clans, which then transformed into an early form of a city-state. He observed as the humanoid race mastered incredible powers and used what seemed like magic to expand their territory. Yet, before he could see what was happening clearly, these early kingdoms fell into ruins one after the other, and the surviving humanoids rapidly built new cities on the foundations of their ancestors. The humans began to contend for living space with the other races on the land. Various kingdoms and beliefs came and went quickly, as they warred with one another while crying out the names of their gods. The process accelerated, and Gawain gradually became unable to process the sea of information that was bombarding him. He even saw giant lizards with massive wings fly through the sky, dragons. He once again wished that he could turn his gaze and follow the dragon to observe its evolution, watch its life cycle, but instead he had to content himself with watching the people. He saw armies with their swords held high and the flames of war that almost destroyed the entire continent. He watched civilizations perish, only to rise again from the ashes. His observations became intermittent glimpses, changing from constant surveillance to glancing down every few years or even decades. When he connected these disparate images together, it gave him the impression of the world accelerating. He had not realized this before because his thoughts were silent when he had taken a break from his observations. Now that he restarted his surveillance, his thoughts began to flow seamlessly again. Thus, he could not have noticed anything wrong with himself. Impact incoming. These words flashed across Gawain's mind like lightning. He could see the transformation of the land below clearly. At the same time, when these words appeared in his mind, another kingdom had fallen from the heights of prosperity to utter ruin again. Gawain had no idea about what was going on, but he knew this situation was definitely not normal. From the images that only appeared before him every few years, and then rapidly swept past his vision, he realized that his thoughts were on the verge of disappearing. His thoughts barely took up 1 second for every century that had passed. The breaks in his thoughts were lengthening too. He noticed that the changes on the land were happening in an unimaginably strange way, and the rapidly evolving slides he skimmed over were now almost indecipherable. At the rate this was going, or maybe after a certain moment had passed, his consciousness might disintegrate in this strange place completely, and he would slumber in that moment forever, with no chance of revival. It had been ages since Gawain felt a sense of urgency. He began to think rigorously of a solution to break free from this situation. If he had a brain, his thoughts would be crazily overwhelming as countless thoughts spewed out. However, the rapidly changing slideshow on the land showed him that his mind had slowed down to 1 frame per 1,000 years. Of course, putting it this way seemed like an exaggeration, but his actual situation was not any better than before. Break free from this situation, break free from this, break free, break free. No matter the means or method, he had to break out of this, even if he had to return to that crashing plane. He could not let himself die in such a strange place in such an inexplicable way. Gawain felt his thoughts becoming muddled and his mind becoming foggy. His once seamless state of mind was now breaking up. He thought with all his might angrily, but as a being who only had a fixed bird's-eye view, his levels of fury had no impact on his situation. However, just as he felt as though his thoughts were going to either disintegrate or be silenced into static forever, a voice intoned from an unknown place. Power source damaged. Mainframe restart failed. Initiating escape sequence. In the next moment, His fixed perspective disappeared, and darkness now engulfed Gawain's vision. But his train of thought did not stop. It was the first time in an eternity that he was still able to think when he closed his eyes. He did not know how long he had remained in the darkness. He felt as though he was rolling as he tumbled down into a cold and narrow space. Strange feelings had returned to his limbs, disorienting his mind. Having spent an unspecified amount of time floating in space, pain and discomfort felt like reintroducing old former lovers, painful, but also achingly familiar. With darkness enshrouding his vision, Gawain could only smell and listen. He smelled dust and dirt and death, and he heard a faint voice on the other side of a barrier. A woman's voice. "Please don't kill me. Save your energy for that dead man rising from the grave." A battle-weary group of adventurers rushed into the cave as fast as their legs could carry them. One of them, a tall woman with grey hair and a red robe, hastily cast a spell as they fled. The catacomb's door slid shut. They were now impervious to the shouts of the guard captain, the screams of the injured and dying, and better yet, the roars and howls of the terrible, wretched monsters. All noise was silenced by the thick stone and steel separating them. Even though everyone knew that this barrier was only temporary, they all breathed an involuntary sigh of relief. Rebecca Cecil found herself relaxing ever so slightly. It would be wonderful if only the hell outside was merely a nightmare. Rebecca shook her head vigorously, as if she could shake away her thoughts. Wishing was a sign of weakness, and weakness would only put them in further danger. The hefty rock would not serve to provide safety for long, but might weaken her will as it let her indulge in a fleeting moment of security. With that thought, the young successor of the Cecil clan could not help gripping onto her already dimmed staff, hoping that this weapon could instill more courage in her. Her clan's knight, Sir Byron Kirk, coughed. "Viscountess, the passageway has been sealed shut, and the monsters shouldn't be able to get in any time soon." Rebecca turned back to look at the loyal and devoted knight. His steel armor was scarred, his breastplate had a noticeable dent, and a burn mark was visible beneath his short grey hair. That blemish had been caused by Aunt Heidi, whose fireball spell saved him from the jaws of a monster, albeit burning him in the process. If not for the God of Fortune's blessing, this knight, who had served the clan for 20 faithful years, would have become nothing more than a corpse. Naturally, Rebecca suspected that it was because of Aunt Heidi's magic infamously missing its mark, as always. "Good work, Sir Byron." Rebecca looked down to conceal the fatigue in her eyes. "At least we can catch our breath for now." She then turned her head around and sized up the remaining people left by her side. 3 of the soldiers had torches in their hands as they guarded the perimeter. Heidi Cecil was inspecting the wall at the end of the stone hall, holding a blazing fireball in her hand for light, as well as for whatever danger might be hiding in the corners. Quivering against the wall was a little maid, clutching a saucepan as if it were a great axe. Rebecca sighed. She couldn't help but sympathize with Betty, as the cleaning lady's large eyes darted around the room searching for any sort of danger. Fear would get them nowhere, but it was hard to keep it at bay forever. Though she didn't say so, Rebecca's greatest fear was that this ragtag band was the only one who made it away from the monsters alive. She couldn't imagine how others might have made it out. After assessing everyone's condition, Rebecca now turned her attention to the stone hall. This was an ancient place. The rectangular stone hallway was webbed with spider silk and thick with dust. At one end of the hall were a number of decaying objects. Even though they were very old, their past beauty and elegance still shone through. The walls of the stone hall were decorated with intricate murals and reliefs. The frescoes were slightly discoloured and had undergone some wear and tear. The images were still quite clear. Heidi Cecil held up the fire in her hand to illuminate the pictures. She scrutinized the murals and reliefs in earnest for a long while. Compared to the modern northern states' frivolous but impractical aesthetics, this hall was adorned simply and solemnly, giving it First Dynasty airs. The murals depicted heroic figures and local customs, and the reliefs were carvings of the symbols of mythology and the gods, stories so old they had been forgotten generations ago. As an erudite spellcaster, Aunt Heidi was well versed in interpreting useful messages from these antique artworks, so she stared at them, enraptured. As she studied the contents of the murals and reliefs, Heidi could not help but hold her left hand up to her chest. She whispered, "May the ancestors forgive us." Rebecca walked over to Heidi's side with her staff in hand. "Aunt Heidi." She was perturbed at her aunt's attitude. It was rare to see Heidi bothered by carvings. Heidi turned her head to face her niece. "This is the resting place of our ancestors, of the founders of Clan Cecil." Rebecca felt a zap of electricity shoot through her veins. She involuntarily swallowed. "It looks like there hasn't been anyone here for a long time." Heidi nodded. "Ever since the Grumman Rebellion, this place has been completely sealed off. We as descendants of the Cecil clan have the knowledge to open it, but the clan rules state that no one should ever step foot in here unless they are at death's door." She cast a long, meaningful look at Rebecca. "We are the first people to enter this place in 100 years. Technically, we are at death's door right now, for opening the door means death." Heidi grimaced. Rebecca hastily dropped her ironic tone. "Will the ancestors forgive us?" Heidi smiled stiffly. She was unable to answer this question, and could only use the hints on the murals as a guide to look for the mechanism to open the burial chamber. It did not take much effort for her to find the special pillar. She pressed a hand on top of it gently. The stone door leading to the burial chamber vibrated slightly, before an entire slab of rock rose, rumbling as it went. However, when the stone slab rose, Rebecca heard a strange noise from within. Heidi gasped at the noises. "There's someone inside! Byron!" Sir Byron's sword was in his hand before Heidi had finished uttering his name. The gallant knight rushed towards the entrance of the stone slab, and the 3 other soldiers followed closely behind, drawing their own blades. After getting over her shock, Rebecca dashed ahead as well. She grabbed Betty by the shoulder. The maid looked at her with her huge eyes, still seeming numb to the world around her. "Find a place to hide, Betty!" The maid scurried away and Rebecca rushed after the soldiers. Just as she ran into the burial chamber, Rebecca saw Sir Byron poised with his sword, ready to swing it onto an agile small figure. The person darted around Sir Byron like a gust of wind, sometimes disappearing into a cloud of smoke and escaping into the shadowy areas of the chamber. Rebecca gasped. Whoever this was, they were clearly adept at shadow manipulation and light on their feet to boot. Sir Byron did not usually spend this long going against stealth users after all. However, with the 3 remaining soldiers encircling them, and Heidi blocking the door of the burial chamber with fire, the dexterous figure lost all their escape routes and landed on the floor, flustered. It was only after their movements stopped that Rebecca could take a good look at the face of this intruder. It was a young girl that looked her age, but a little shorter. She was wearing old leather armor, had short dark hair, high cheekbones, and bold, arching eyebrows. Even though her face was stained with much dirt, Rebecca could tell that she was a beauty. Her most striking feature was her ears, which were pointed. Rebecca gasped. She leaned over to her aunt. "An elf!" Heidi snorted. "Half-elf. Ears are not long enough." Rebecca nodded, understanding. "What's the other half?" Heidi sighed, clearly frustrated that her niece didn't remember basic lessons. "No way of telling. The elfin bloodline runs strong. She could be half human or half monster." Rebecca grimaced, imagining an elf wishing to couple with the creatures who nearly slaughtered them all, but she shook the thought away quickly. Once the half-elf girl landed on the ground, Sir Byron immediately stepped forward and pressed his long sword against her neck. The remaining 3 soldiers closed in an instant, blocking her escape with their blades. Heidi walked up briskly, her voice quaking with barely tempered rage. "How dare you break into the tomb of Clan Cecil?" For an aristocrat like her, the fact that her ancestors' resting place had been broken into by a tomb raider was downright sacrilege. News of this could severely damage their clan's reputation. Not that it needed the help, Rebecca was also glaring at the half-elf. Her fury was not as deep-seated as her aunt's, but it was hard to not feel personally offended that this intruder had violated the tomb of her ancestors. Even though this robber was being pinned down by 3 swords, none of those blades were as sharp as the daggers with which Rebecca and Heidi glared. The half-elf trembled and thrust her hands in the air. Wait! I haven't stolen anything yet!" Sir Byron's sword pressed deeper into her neck. The robber tensed as a tiny drop of blood trickled down her throat. "How dare you!" Just as the knight's voice fell, a strange clattering noise rang out from the black steel coffin in the middle of the burial chamber. Everyone's ears picked up the sound and they quietened immediately. After a moment of silence, Rebecca was the first to react. She conjured a head-sized fireball above her staff and shook it at the half-kneeling half-elf on the floor. "What did you do to my ancestor?" The Tomb Raider's eyes welled up with tears. "Please don't kill me. Save your energy for that dead man rising from the grave." Accompanying the half-elf girl's voice was the increasingly loud rattling noise from the black steel coffin, which was even starting to shake the lid. Heidi's face went as pale as a sheet. "The dead man! Our ancestor!" This was the first time that this dignified and elegant lady who patronized the aristocratic circles lost her cool. "Please rest in peace. The person who has disturbed your sleep will be punished," the rogue moaned. "How will saying all this nonsense help now? Hurry up and hold down the lid of your ancestor's coffin." The three soldiers looked at each other. Even Byron was in a state of shock. However, Rebecca reacted this time. She rushed up swiftly to the platform where the coffin lay, just as the lid slid to the side and a hand emerged from the gap. "Lord Ancestor, please rest in peace." Rebecca brought her magic staff down on the hand. The hand vanished back into the coffin. Everyone looked at each other. Rebecca lifted her head dazedly. She saw her knight aunt and the three soldiers staring at her, their mouths agape. Half of them were convinced that they had made up the shouting voice until it sounded again. "Who the hell hit my hand?" Rebecca looked down at the magic staff in her hand. Fear gripped her heart and her eyes misted over. "Have I offended our ancestors?" Heidi grabbed Rebecca by her collar and pulled her away from the coffin. "Rebecca, get off of there!" Rebecca furrowed her brow at her aunt. "Aunt? This could be a rising undead." Rebecca had never seen her aunt so distressed. "Or it could mean that those monsters have defiled the sacred remains of our ancestors." The possibility of this made Rebecca break out in cold sweat. Just then, the heavy lid of the black steel coffin rattled again. This time it broke off its hinges and flew into the air. When the dust cleared, Rebecca saw a majestic-looking man with short brown hair and dressed in ancient aristocratic garb sitting in the coffin. The half-elf girl, who was half kneeling on the ground, turned to look back at the scene and squeaked. "See? I told you! Your ancestor has been raised from the dead." Gawain's head spun. His hands groped the sides of the box in which he now sat. It was black and made of cold metal. Though what sort of metal, Gawain had no notion. His feet ached after kicking the lid off this coffin. His brain was being assaulted by a sense of disorientation and vertigo he had never experienced before. His ears rang loudly, and every part of his body throbbed and ached. The figures in front of him were multiplied into 4 of each, and 2 of them had no colour but presented themselves in black and white. It was a miracle he could still think sensibly, even though his head itself was swirling with chaos. Perhaps I should thank whoever had hit me with a stick. Pain does bring clarity. In the process of getting his thoughts back in order, Gawain finally remembered what had happened earlier. The sudden blanking out of his vision, the start of some escape program, the illusion of falling, and now this solid feeling mobile body. "A body! I have a body again!" Gawain laughed in pure relief. It was hardly a pleasant experience, waking up. But after having floated in the sky for heaven knew how long, he felt so grateful to be in a body again. It was understandable that his mind was confused, and that he was disoriented by the sensations he felt from all over his body, for it had been too many years since he had any sense other than his vision. Even if his sanity had been preserved for some unknown reason, it was still difficult for him to get used to being able to feel temperature and pain. However, Gawain could sense that he was acclimatizing to this body, and the feeling of returning to a material state. A moment passed and his head stopped spinning. The quadruple images merged into 2, one in black and white, the other in full color. Then, finally, they merged into 1. The vertigo subsided. He blinked several times as his head cleared, and he finally was able to understand the shapes around him. The first thing he saw were 4 burly men in combat attire. One of them was a middle-aged man whose hair and beard was streaked with white. He was outfitted in sturdy steel armor, which was gilded with decorations. He held a long silver sword and looked so muscular that even his face seemed to hold much strength underneath his visage. The other 3 men's armor and weapons were much simpler, with an emphasis on practicality. Gawain suspected they had been mass-manufactured. A petite girl in leather armor was kneeling on the floor, subdued by these large men. Her face was hidden by a mop of black hair, but he noticed the sharp ears sticking out of it. Farther away stood a woman in a long red dress. She carried herself with maturity and elegance. Gawain could not help but notice her hourglass figure as well as the anxiety and fear reflected in her regal gaze. However, a noise nearby instantly absorbed Gawain's attention. He turned his head and saw a young girl who looked at most 16 or 17 jumping down from the stone platform in a panic. She held a metal staff. Gawain pointed at the young girl. "Did you hit me just now?" after he spoke. He was immediately stunned. The words that had come out of his mouth were not in Mandarin, but a language he had never heard before. However, these foreign words seemed to flow off his tongue as though he had been born knowing them. The young girl trembled with fear. Her eyes welled up with apologetic tears. She looked like she was about to cry. "Lord Ancestor, you must forgive me. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Gawain cocked his head in confusion. He had observed this world for ages, but this was the first time he was a part of the action rather than observing from the sky. "Who are you?" The aristocratic woman in the red dress looked like the calmest person on hand. After Gawain had sat up and started a conversation spontaneously, the fear and anxiety on her face had lessened greatly, and it was she who stepped forward at this moment. Even though she looked wary, she still spoke with composure. "Do you know who you are?" "Me." Gawain froze for a moment. He opened his mouth to speak his name but then stopped. "I need to be careful. I'm not the same person I used to be." He looked down at the box he was in. Even though the design was a little unusual, it was definitely a coffin. Glancing at his surroundings again, he noticed that even though it was more spacious than his home in his past life, this cavernous room was clearly a catacomb. It all came together. Gawain shuddered. His new body. He must be inhabiting a corpse. That would explain the expressions of those surrounding him. If he were to introduce himself as someone who did not have the same name as this corpse, he imagined that those mass-produced swords would soon be at his newly acquired throat. What had the young girl called me earlier? Lord Ancestor, was it? So I must be in her ancestor's body. Looking down, he was astonished to see that the corpse's body was not decomposed, desiccated or foul in any respect. Their ancestor must have had a healthy diet, but that was no concern at the moment. More importantly, he was a foreign soul possessing their ancestor's body, lying in their ancestor's tomb, and even delivering a kick that sent their ancestor's coffin lid flying. He had to play along and keep his true identity a secret. With that reasoning, Gawain looked down and pretended to be deep in thought, while in reality he was rapidly thinking of excuses to provide, such as having memory confusion after such a long sleep. However, just as he gathered his wits about him, a powerful wave of dizziness struck him. He had just gotten used to his new body with some difficulty and shed the vertigo, only to be attacked by a second round of faintness. His body almost collapsed back into the coffin, and the aristocratic woman raised her magic staff in the instant she saw Gawain's strange motion. Fire danced along her fingertips. She was on the verge of lobbing a fireball right into her ancestor's face when Gawain's low voice piped up, interrupting her gesture. "Gawain Cecil! I'm Gawain Cecil, a pioneer of the Anzu kingdom. What century is this?" Gawain lifted his head slowly as he spoke. His gaze was as calm and deep as the sea. The thoughts in his mind, however, were as turbulent as crashing waves. The memories belonging to Gawain Cecil were pouring out in a mad rush, but they were being categorized and recorded as though his brain was a computer's hard drive. In the brief moment of his dizziness, his mind had retrieved the information that was easiest to understand, and made him aware of the identity he was supposed to mimic. The biggest surprise was the corpse's name. He was also named Gawain. It was just that this Gawain did not hold the surname of Gao, but had a different one, Cecil. Was this some kind of coincidence? Right now, Gawain had no energy to think about how miraculous this coincidence was, for the memories of Gawain Cecil were still gushing forth. He had to concentrate every inch of his fibre to not faint or reveal a ferocious expression on his face. Under this foggy state, he could vaguely hear the young girl who had hit him with her metal staff answer him in a clear voice. "This is year 735 of the Anzu calendar. Lord Ancestor has been sleeping for over 700 years. The woman in the red dress let out a sigh of relief when she heard Gawain's answer. The flames on her fingertips vanished. As a scholarly spellcaster, she had some knowledge about the undead. These blasphemous creatures had a fatal flaw in their souls. In the moments of their awakening, they were almost unable to speak or think, and even though the stronger ones may soon acquire the power of thought, they had no memories of their previous life. One more thing was that they could never tell their own names, even if they had retrieved their memories, or if someone had told it to them. If they were to speak the name of their past life, the fire of their soul would turn on them and burn them. And even if they could not be burned to death, that kind of pain was unbearable to the undead, not to mention that the burning of a soul was a phenomenon that could not be concealed. Thus, her unease melted away. However, she was still in great confusion, because if the ancestor she was looking at did not rise back from the dead, there was no other explanation for this. "Ancestor, why did you suddenly wake up after dying?" But no matter how confused she was, she still had to behave with propriety. The lady in red thus stepped forward and bowed nervously. "Ancestor of the Cecil clan, I am your descendant, Dame Heidi Cecil. This young woman beside me is my niece, the Viscountess Rebecca Cecil. Please, on account of her youth, do not pursue her rash conduct, and please forgive us for disturbing your rest. Well, so this person in front of him is Gawain Cecil's great-granddaughter, or great-great, or great-great-great. Gawain got to 5 greats before he stopped counting, and the one alongside her was descended from his line as well. The tumult of memories rushing in had finally ceased, but there was no time for Gawain to peruse the orderly files in his mind, for he had to make sense of the situation around him as soon as possible. He grunted as he leaned on the coffin to get up. "I'm all right. Will someone help me to my feet?" He realized that he had overestimated how acclimatized he was to his body, and felt a little embarrassed that he still could not get up. Rebecca, who was staring at him with apprehension as she gripped her staff in her hand, realized that this was her moment to shine. She jumped up to the stone platform at once and held Gawain's elbow. "Worry not. I'll help you out of the coffin." It sounded strange no matter how he listened to it. More than 700 years! Rebecca took hold of his arm and helped Gawain's stiff body out of the coffin. He looked down and eyed his clothes. His size confused Rebecca. "What material is this made of?" Rebecca took a glance at his garments. "It looks like moon shadow cloth, woven by the elves." With Rebecca's help, Gawain was able to step down from the stone platform and stand firmly on the ground. He felt his control over this body increasing swiftly, as though his soul was doing a rapid driver installation, such that his mind and body were attuned with astonishing speed. He released Rebecca's hand and tried to take a small step forward. He was almost in tears at the next moment. If there was a microphone beside him, he felt that he could thank every single person he ever knew and every single TV station with unique phrases of gratitude for all. But from what he could tell, such technology was still far from this world. He chuckled to himself. In most shows he watched in his previous life, the hero was able to fight already immediately after transmigrating. But Gawain was barely able to walk in his new body. Then he stopped. Rebecca's grip tightened involuntarily. "What's the matter, ancestor?" Gawain's gaze scoured the room. "Where's the elfin girl?" Gawain felt that his condition was improving rapidly. His mind was becoming clearer, and he had attained smooth control of his body. He finally had the energy to turn his attention to the girl, pinned down by the 4 swords. What's going on here? The half-elf girl shrunk. She hoped that the shock of seeing a risen ancestor would make these Cecil clan members forget her. No such luck. She didn't even have a second's distraction to slip away. She cleared her throat. I just thought I could come in and hide for a while. Heidi snarled at her. An excellent hiding place, a secret burial chamber. The thief grimaced. Her lie had been painfully obvious. Heidi turned to Gawain. Ancestor, this despicable grave robber desecrated your resting place and roused you from your sleep. Dazed for a moment, Gawain gave the half-elf girl a reappraising look. In other words, you are the one who woke me up. If it was not for the limitations of the body, the thief girl would have wanted to retract her head into her pelvic cavity. She blubbered out an answer with a shaking voice. I really didn't do anything. I was only trying to find a safe place to hide at first, but when I came in, my occupational habit acted up, and I ended up in the burial chamber. But when I got here, I didn't. Gawain held up his hand. The thief ceased blabbering. In any case, thank you. The half-elf's eyes widened. Her jaw fell slack. What? Rebecca, Heidi, Sir Byron, and the soldiers all looked at Gawain as if his face had just started melting. Regardless, Gawain continued. Let her go. It doesn't look good for 4 big men like you to be seizing a little girl like this. After saying thanks, Gawain realized that he must have committed some faux pas, but he could not retract his words anymore. Dame Heidi furrowed her brows in confusion. But ancestor, she's desecrated your place of reset. Gawain waved his hand dismissively. I want to thank her for waking me up from my sleep. Let her go. In times such as these, we shall forgive these slights. Do you agree? Sir Byron gave the Cecil ancestor an odd look. Heidi gestured toward the stalwart knight with her head. Byron sighed and sheathed his sword. The 3 soldiers beside him followed after and stepped back. The half-elf girl looked around. At first it seemed like she thought this was some prank they were playing on her. Then she stood and faced Gawain. Since you're an elder, you have to mean what you say. Don't go back on your word. The corner of Dame Heidi's eyes twitched. Even after years of learning the proper decorum and self-control of the aristocracy, she still wanted to give this thief a clip round the ear. Gawain looked at the girl curiously. From the memory he had just inherited, he was able to determine that she should be a half-elf. What is your name? The half-elf girl batted her eyelashes shyly. Amber. Gawain stroked his chin. Amber. It does sound forest elfish. A rumble sounded from deeper within the catacombs. Everyone looked around, suddenly tense. Heidi rushed forward, placing herself between Gawain and the so-called Amber. Lord Ancestor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this isn't the time for small talk. We're not safe here. Trying to assume his new identity, Gawain looked at Heidi seriously. What's happening outside? Rebecca squeaked. Monsters! From the Selin Crossing and the mines. The army and the security forces were no match for them. I'm afraid that they have already completely occupied the territory outside. Heidi nodded and turned to Gawain, delivering her report like she was a scout returning to a general. We've done our utmost to organize a resistance. Before the situation turned for the worse, I had Sir Philip take some soldiers with him to help the civilians take refuge. However, before the second team of rescuers could set off, the monsters destroyed the drawbridge. Heidi's countenance became grim, and Gawain could have sworn he detected traces of shame in her downcast visage. Worry not, ancestor. Rebecca and I did not soil the reputation of the Cecil clan. Likewise for these brave warriors. We fought in the castle all the way until the last moment when the gate to the inner courtyard was broken through. That was when we had no other choice but to retreat here. The group of them walked further into the catacombs, searching for some way of escaping, and all the while Heidi informed Gawain of what had transpired. This was the Cecil clan's ancestral territory that had passed down ever since the first ancestor to the present generation. Rebecca, the one who had hit Gawain on the head, turned out to be the lady of this territory, even though she looked young enough to still be in high school. After the monsters attacked, the young Viscountess did all she could to organize a resistance, but it failed. The monsters eventually destroyed all their defensive forces and slaughtered many civilians. As for the half-elf called Amber, she was indeed a bandit, but this time she was really here to take refuge. But this bandit lady's skills were really something. She actually found her way to the deepest part of the Cecil clan's ancestral burial chamber. Gawain sighed. What a mess I woke up to. He rubbed his forehead as he tried to draw from his memories to find information that could help him to solve this crisis. So, those monsters have completely taken over outside, and venturing out would be to knock on death's door. Speaking of which, what exactly are these monsters you keep talking about? Heidi rubbed her chin thoughtfully. We don't know. They seem to be some sort of demon subspecies. But demons haven't appeared in the prime material world for many years already, let alone on such a large scale. Grasping the staff, Rebecca looked to Gawain with hopeful eyes. Lord Ancestor, can you deal with the monsters outside even with your power? Gawain froze. Me? Yes. After all, you were the most powerful knight in all of the Anzu kingdom and all of the northern continent. Rebecca's eyes glowed with hope. It was said that you beheaded the barbarian warlord Gorg in a single stroke. Gawain quickly searched his own memory. What this young lady said was true. Gawain Cecil was a legendary hero. He was the greatest hero during the Anzu kingdom's pioneering era, and he was one of the earliest pioneers in the period of the Second Settlement. After the fall of the ancient Gondolian Empire, the remaining people of the empire returned to a state of disorder and savagery. The lights of human civilization were gradually engulfed by the chaotic wave that spread from the hinterland of the continent and brought them into the Dark Ages. Gawain Cecil and a group of brave men led the surviving humans to escape the ruins of the fallen empire. They marched forth in 4 directions. The group that headed north were the founders of the Anzu kingdom, and Gawain Cecil was one of them. The Gawain of old set out on the journey as a 15-year-old boy and became the youngest pioneering knight in those days, blazing a trail with the other pioneering knights and the first of Anzu's kings. They spent a decade in the northern part of the continent establishing a new nation and bringing mankind back to civilization and order. After the nation was founded, he became one of the 7 generals of the kingdom. He defended the southern borders, resisted multiple demonic attacks of various scales, and had never lost once. However, his brilliant life was like a bright flame, burning quickly through all its fuel. This legendary character only lived to be 35 years old. In the last battle against the Dark Forces, Gawain Cecil died. The memory that he inherited ended there. This was the life of such a brave character. Gawain felt his forehead twitching. I've possessed the body of an incredible person. After his astonishment, Gawain felt suddenly nervous. But how can I live up to a hero of legend? Rebecca was looking at him with hopeful eyes. Amber gave him the same look. Even Heidi, who seemed the most mature and composed, was also looking at him with eyes filled with anticipation and trust. But the person they were looking at was Gawain Cecil, not the new Gawain. Gawain looked down at his own hand. It was the hand of a warrior. It was thick and tough, calloused and used to violence. But he did not know how much power he could muster from this body. If I'm to survive, then I must play this part. Gawain shook away the feelings of doubt in his head. Admittedly, he was a little shocked by Gawain Cecil's legendary life. But what he needed now was not to be amazed or to be unconfident, but to be steady. The source of this confidence was simple. He had watched this world from the sky. He had seen it begin. Though these memories did not have practical value, they did give him a mental boost. Then, with this strength, he would find a way to survive. Once calmed down, the solution would naturally come to him. He quickly found something useful in Gawain Cecil's memory. He swallowed the lump in his throat and spoke finally. We cannot simply fight our way out, I'm afraid. I have been sleeping for too long. I'm not sure how much strength I can muster, and we can't be sure just how strong the monsters outside can be. Thus, our best choice is to find a way to get around these monsters and flee to a safe place. Rebecca gasped. But the drawbridge has been destroyed, and several other roads have been blocked. Gawain waved his hand and interrupted this granddaughter of his, separated by an unknown number of generations. Underground. The Cecil territory was once part of the kingdom's southern defense line. There is a secret tunnel system underground. The bulk of it is blessed by earth elementals, so it won't collapse, not even in 1,000 years. And the entrance to this secret tunnel is beneath the castle. Everyone gasped. The hopeful look in Rebecca's eyes was soon complemented by surprise. There is such a thing. What are we waiting for then? Let's go find the tunnel. Lord Ancestor, please lead the way. Gawain clenched his teeth. There's a problem. Gawain held out his hands in confusion. I only know how to get there from the castle, but I don't know the way there from the tomb. Everyone looked at each other. Fear and frustration filled the air, stronger than smoke. Salvation was in their grasp, but misplaced memories might still spell their doom. A tense silence filled the catacombs until Gawain finally spoke. I was brought here when I died. How am I supposed to know the exact layout of the tombs? Rebecca opened her mouth but felt a tug on her sleeve. She turned and met her aunt's gaze. Dame Heidi shook her head, and Rebecca refrained from speaking. She had been about to remind her ancestor that the royal tombs were built when that king was still alive. Even the king himself participated in its design. She reckoned, however, that if she were to speak up, Aunt Heidi might just incinerate her into dust. Thus, Rebecca swallowed her words, turned to Gaiwan and smiled awkwardly. Of course, that makes sense. Heidi walked to the bolted doors. The sound of monsters snarling echoed through. We can't go back the same way. She calmly analysed the situation and turned back to Gawain. The entrance to the castle courtyard and the ancestral tombs have been occupied by the monsters. We have to find another way out. Gawain searched his inherited memory. It's been 700 years. Has the castle not been renovated? Heidi gestured upward with her staff. The upper floors of the castle have undergone reconstruction, but the foundation has remained the same. Gawain extended his hand to a soldier. Lend me your sword, will you? After taking the long sword from the soldier, Gawain drew a sketch on the ground. First, he sketched the top view of the castle's outline, followed by a side view of the castle roughly divided into 3 levels. Though the sketches were drawn in a hurry, the different sections of the castle could be made out quite clearly. He pointed to the bottom section. The entrance is here, 2 levels underground. It's close to the wine cellar and the granary, at least it used to be. There are 2 passages to get here, but we would have to enter these passages from the surface, which I assume is infested with monsters. Rebecca looked curiously at Gawain's sketches. The wine cellar and granary are still there, but I never knew a 3rd room existed. Gawain chuckled. It's not a room, but a mezzanine, constructed with a clever architectural trick to be hidden between the wall and the supporting beams. With our land located along the southern border, the monsters emerging from the wasteland of Gondolia came to attack every fortnight. In these situations, the hidden passageways and levels were indispensable. They can be used for emergency evacuation and as a supply route when under siege. Sir Byron took a serious look at the simple map and pulled out his long sword to trace the bottom corner of the map. So we have to advance to the entrance at the 2nd level of the castle and not pass through the courtyard or the passages on the ground floor. This is where we are. The ancestral tomb is an underground structure built in the southeast section of the castle. It coincides with about 1/3 of the castle's structural base. Gawain put his sword over Byron's. In this overlapping area there should be a passage. The tomb was built 700 years ago. These craftsmen were the same ones who built the fortress. These buildings were built in accordance with the standards and regulations then. They must have made an alternative route. Violent knocks sent a jolt up Gawain's spine and shook the buttresses of the catacombs. Dust rained from above. The catacomb's stone doors seemed to be fracturing. Thin cracks laced along the stone. Sir Byron rushed to hold the door down. Viscountess Rebecca, Dame Heidi, Lord Ancestor, we need to get out of here soon. As the knight pushed against the stone doors, Gawain flinched, seeing through the sliver of an opening to the sludge-like appearance of the creatures outside. Sir Byron ordered the 3 other soldiers to help, and together they forced the doors to close. With the crisis averted, but time running out, Gawain turned to Rebecca and gave her a strange look. You really don't know anything about a hidden passage. This knowledge should have been passed down in the Cecil family through the generations. Rebecca looked down, embarrassed. Ancestor, we fail to live up to the glory that you have fought to bring to the family. Heidi bit her lip. The Cecil clan has been through many things in these 700 years. Gawain sighed. I'm sure. But this was not the time for telling stories. After we get out of here, we can talk about all that happened these past 700 years. The matter at hand is to find the way to the hidden passageway out of the tomb. Rebecca, Heidi and Byron squatted down and studied the sketch. Though they were familiar with the House Cecil Castle, no one was familiar with how the tomb was constructed. After all, this 700-year-old tomb was not just some tourist attraction that could be entered for 2 silver coins, let alone somewhere they could take a stroll around every few days. Even before the tomb was sealed 100 years ago, the descendants of the Cecil clan could only enter the tomb on a few rare occasions in their lifetime. And even then, they were instructed never to go near their ancestors' resting grounds. How would they know where the hidden passageway was? In the face of this problem, even Gawain's own memory as an eye in the sky was no help. After all, he certainly did not expect that sometime in the future he would rise up in the body of a 700-year-old corpse. They crouched there, silent, each of them racking their brains for a solution as the monsters pounded at the walls a mere few feet from them. They were running out of time. And then Amber suddenly piped up, "I might know a way." Immediately everyone turned their attention to the half-elf tomb raider. Heidi frowned. "How do you know?" The eyes on Amber scared her, but seeing Gawain give her an encouraging nod, she found the courage to speak. "It's the way I came from, of course. What if that was the hidden passage?" Gawain chuckled. "Of course! How did we not think of that? Please, lead the way." Amber wiped some sweat off her brow. "In return, will you forgive me for intruding upon this royal tomb?" Heidi glared at the blabbering half-elf, grabbed her staff and walked toward the tomb's entrance. Gawain, however, stopped before going on his way. Rebecca looked at him curiously. "Lord Ancestor?" Gawain paced around the dimly lit tomb. Though he was not the legendary duke who opened up the new territory 700 years ago, he still had the common sense to find a weapon to defend himself in a dangerous place like this. "I need a weapon too." A soldier undid his belt and sword at his waist and was ready to hand it over, but Gawain waved his hand and declined the soldier's offering. Guided by his memory, he went to the black steel coffin and poked his head into the coffin in search of something. From within the coffin, he pulled out a heavy longsword that was entirely black except for a faint tinge of red on the blade near the hilt. The moment he gripped the sword, a familiar feeling arose. It was as if every wrinkle on the handle of the sword fitted seamlessly with the lines of his palm. Gawain instinctively swung the long sword. Every swing felt like the result of years of practice. Though it was a pleasant surprise, it was not too unexpected. Besides the remnant muscle memory, he could also recall everything Gawain Cecil ever studied about combat and warfare. Not only did it include basic swordsmanship and horse riding, but also arcane powers that seemed magical to Gawain. This part of the memories excited him, but now was not the time to experiment. Step 1, leave the catacombs. Step 2, play with magic. Rebecca's eyes widened at the sight of the black longsword, and even her voice shook slightly. This must be Anzu's legendary sword of the founder. Hearing that, Heidi, who had already walked to the bolted entrance, immediately turned back. She stared at the sword in Gawain's hand, unable to hide her astonishment. "The sword of the founder?" Gawain sighed and brandished the blade. "Currently it's merely a sharp sword. It has already been 700 years since I wielded it. Even if it received elven blessings to be protected from decay, the magic within has already evaporated. I don't know how long it would take to regain it." With that said, Gawain turned to look at the coffin. There was a small stone platform, but a vague concave imprint. Gawain frowned. "Do I not also have a shield? Was it not also buried with me?" Heidi became grim. "Lord Ancestor, your descendants have once again failed you. 100 years ago, a descendant named Grumman Cecil took the shield and lost it on the battlefield." Heidi hesitated before she spoke again. Obviously, there were many things that she left out. Perhaps she feared that if she were to spill all of what had happened 100 years ago, Gawain might decide to just crawl back into his coffin. Gawain huffed a sigh of indignation. What a disgrace to House Cecil! I suppose I should consider myself lucky to wake up in my old garb and not stripped of all my belongings. Rebecca and Heidi both looked down in reverence. Their ancestor had just stepped out of his coffin to berate their grandfather. This was something beyond their wildest fantasies. Gawain felt the weight of the dark longsword and looked at Amber. "Lead us out of here." Along with the soldiers, they hurried out into the stone hall of the catacombs. Rebecca peered towards a dark corner and waved. "Betty, come on out! We're leaving now!" Gawain looked over curiously and saw a slender girl appear from the shadows. She seemed to be younger than Rebecca, wearing a skirt made of coarse material. Adolescent freckles dotted her face, and her flaxen hair was loose behind her head as she held on tightly to a saucepan in her hand. Upon seeing Gawain, apprehension came over the young lady. Rebecca introduced her to Gawain. "This is the castle's maidservant Betty. We don't know how she was left behind by the first group of rescuers that broke out. In any case, she somehow followed us here. Betty, this is—" An abrupt quaking from above the catacombs interrupted Rebecca. Gawain lifted his longsword. "Enough chit-chat. I just woke up. I don't intend to be buried again. Let's go." The group hurried along the royal tombs, their steps hurried but careful. Heidi waved her staff, and the wall-mounted candles flickered to life, lighting the path forward. The sound of monsters echoed through the walls. Every corner they took, they expected to meet danger. The grumbling ringed familiar to Gawain, but his head was still spinning with memories of old and older. They walked down a darker hall when Gawain held up his hand. He heard a strange chittering. "Do you hear?" Before he could finish his sentence, a flock of bats swarmed them. Heidi rushed forward, a ball of fire summoned from her staff. The bats skittered away, back into the deepest recesses of the catacombs. Gawain gripped his ancestral blade. He had frozen up at that moment. He was in a new body, but that was no excuse. He looked to the others and held his poise. "Let's keep moving." They continued on carefully until eventually Amber stopped in front of a stone wall. Gawain furrowed his brows. "What is it?" Amber placed a hand on the cool stone. "We're here. This is where I came from." Rebecca and Heidi shared a look. Evidently, they did not understand either. Amber, the master of stealth and manipulator of shadows, curved her lips into a sliver of a smile. "Anything can be a door, anything can be a lock, and anything can be a key. Rid your mind of the commonplace definitions and even a carrot can open the vaults into the royal treasury." Amber closed her eyes. Darkness consumed her hand like a miasma. The dark vapor expanded out from her hand and spread across the stone wall. Amber pushed her hand into the darkness. Gawain and the others watched her hand sink inside the wall. Around her, the dark vapor corroded the stone, revealing a hidden passage. Everyone followed her through the dark tunnel. The passageway, built with rocks and spirit-subduing bricks, was more spacious than Gawain remembered. Neither he nor Byron, both over 6 feet tall and wearing their heavily clad knight armor, felt cramped in the passageway. The candle wicks along the path roared with fire after Heidi cast a basic spell. The candlelight lit the way as they ventured forth. In the dim glow, Amber tried to read the expressions of everyone else. She felt that they were increasingly guarded towards her, after seeing what she could do. "I'm a descendant of forest elves. I swear I wouldn't do such a lowly thing as digging graves. I'm a mere bandit trying to get by." Gawain scoffed. "A bandit is a bandit." Amber shrugged. "Elves learn to pick locks and break seals before they can walk. It is the same as asking a bird not to fly." Rebecca glanced over. "Are you a citizen of the Cecil territory?" Amber pondered this in earnest. "I lived here for several years, but I never applied to become an official citizen. But according to the rules of the Cecil territory, if you live for more than 3 years here and pay taxes on time, you are counted as a citizen. Am I wrong?" Rebecca shook her head. "If you didn't apply, then you're not one of us." Amber whistled. "Oh well, why do you ask?" Rebecca looked away. "I'm the feudal lady of House Cecil. which means if you were a citizen, it'd be my duty to protect you. Amber beamed. Well, allow me to change my answer. I'm a citizen. Rebecca smirked. Too late. Gawain shook his head in amusement, listening to the two. Though he had woken up to such a mess, the feeling of being a human was far better than being confined without a physical body to watch the world from above. He looked at Heidi walking behind him. This lady, his granddaughter of who knew how many generations after him, had taken several furtive glances at him already. He waited for her to start talking, but seeing as she was the reticent type, he bit the bullet. What is it? Heidi started. At first, she seemed lost for words, but she eventually spoke. Your face, Lord Ancestor, it's not even a blemish different from your portraits. I still can't believe that you are back from the dead. Gawain nodded. Indeed, I am Gawain Cecil, a pioneer from 700 years ago. I can recite the 30 years of everything I experienced in my life. Or would you like me to tell you about the times during the Second Settlement? But to be honest, I'm afraid all these wouldn't be much proof. A good historian would be able to tell you about all these things. But you wanted to confirm that I'm the real Gawain, right? Heidi looked away. Please forgive me for having doubts, Lord Ancestor. Although there have been stories of resurrection since ancient times, it is quite another matter to see it with my own eyes. I heard that some paladins and moon elves could sleep for years, and even up to decades, relying on the power of the holy light and the elven arts to preserve their soul and life force, but a human knight resting in a tomb for 700 years. She trailed off and Gawain sighed. He searched his memories and knowledge of the world, but he could not muster an explanation either. To tell you the truth, I don't know what's going on as well. Perhaps it has something to do with what I've been through in the past. I've received blessings from the elementals as the Second Settlement came to be. It might have done something to my body. Heidi stopped in her tracks. Do you hear that? Everyone halted and listened. Gawain heard it. A breeze. Heidi nodded. The magic feels different too. We're probably close to the end of the tomb. Gawain grasped the sword of the founder tightly in his hand. A vague feeling of uneasiness heightened his senses. Sir Byron stepped forward and unsheathed his steel broadsword. Be on guard! The old knight ran his hand along the sword, and the blade glowed with a bright light. Sir Byron pointed to the other soldiers. You three, guard the rear. The three men drew their blades ready to battle. Though they only had the most basic combat skills, they had, after all, managed to live through defending against the monsters. As soldiers trained by the House Cecil, their courage alleviated the nervousness in Amber and Betty, the slender maidservant at the centre of the group. Though the passageway was long, they saw the exit. On both sides of the stone walls, the spirit-subduing stones embedded every 10 meters that marked the tomb came to an end. Something like a crossroad with a more open space appeared up ahead. This was the intersection of the tomb and the castle's underground system. It was also the centre of the network of ancient hidden passageways. Amber pointed to one of the paths at the crossroad. That's where I came in from. It leads to a dry well outside the castle, but it's probably occupied by monsters now. Gawain looked to Heidi. Which way is west? Heidi drew a simple magic symbol in the air. The symbol turned into a glowing ribbon, swiveling in the air as it stopped in a certain direction. Gawain looked down the passageway, but a gentle breeze sent a chill up his spine. He sensed danger. Before he could process it, he lifted his blade to parry. Instinct took over, and instinct saved his life. A dark blast rammed into the blade, dissipating into the air. In the darkness of a tunnel at the crossroads, 3 swaying figures emerged. Betty blanched. Sir Byron lifted his broadsword. Rebecca and Heidi held their sorcery at the tip of their tongues. Gawain's eyes widened. 3 shriveled and deformed giants stepped into the dim light, their bodies made of a sludgy, mud-like substance. They stood 3 meters tall, the amorphous sludge bubbling along the surface, occasionally exposing the red skeletal structure underneath. They looked like monsters created by the dark arts of necromancers and warlocks. Heidi stamped her staff on the ground, casting a lesser buff of clarity that warded away the fearsome aura the monsters inflicted. Lord Ancestor, these are the monsters! Gawain was not scared, however, but shocked. He did not voice it out loud, but he was sure now that he had seen these monsters before. Two monsters rushed Gawain at the same time. The middle one raised a sludgy hand and conjured dark energy, condensing into an arrow that flew straight for Amber. Sir Byron stepped up at the last second. His illuminated broadsword parried the shadow arrow. Without reprieve, the knight lunged forward to take on the incoming monsters. Gawain turned to the others. Heidi, Rebecca, take the one that can shoot the arrows. Do not attempt arcane magic. It is useless against them. Amber and the rest of the soldiers protect the spellcasters. Then Gawain rushed forward. In his past life, he had never wielded a sword to battle before, much less fought against otherworldly monsters. This was the first time he had set foot upon the soils of this other world. 700 years ago, the Gawain Cecil of old could take on 100 of them single-handedly. Will I fail to take on just the 3 of them? Doubt flooded his mind as he ran. He wondered if he could fight back, if this body was strong enough, if the legendary longsword had lost all of its magic. If he had the choice, he might have fled. Fate does not leave you in a circumstance of your own choosing. You are standing here, and the monsters are with you. With nowhere else to run, with an old sword in your hand, with no shield because a good-for-nothing descendant stole it, what else can you do? Gawain roared out a fierce war cry, blasting away the doubt. Then he charged at the monster. Grasping the longsword tightly as he rushed toward the sludge-like monsters, Gawain eradicated all nervousness, hesitation, and fear. He still remembered the moment when his plane crashed. He still remembered observing this world from high above for what felt like an eternity. He still felt strange in the body of Gawain Cecil. However, at that moment he grasped the ancestral longsword tightly and threw himself at the monster. With almost pure instinct, he dodged the monster's claws. Gawain swiveled his upper body in a small semicircle and swung his blade. He drew an arc in the air, slashing at the monster's shoulders. As the blade swung down, he utilized all the power in this body, directing it to the longsword in his hand. As if charged by his power, the faint red thread on the blade near the hilt burst with a red light. Like a flame, the red glow extended rapidly along the blade. As it burned and roared with intense heat, even the surrounding air started to shimmer. The giant monster grimaced away from the heat and, with an agility that did not match its large figure, it leaned back, dodging Gawain's slash by a hair. Gawain backed away too. He calmed himself down after releasing the magical power and focused on infusing his longsword with the same red energy. Sure enough, he was able to call upon Gawain Cecil's abilities. This body had not yet deteriorated to the extent that no power could be mustered from it. Though he did not know how much power he could draw, it was a huge boost to Gawain's confidence. He grinned. Now he knew he could hold his own. Meanwhile, Byron fought against another of the monsters. The mid-level knight was one of the top fighters in all of the Cecil territory. His fighting career before he swore loyalty to the Cecil clan had allowed him to accumulate rare combat experience. However, he had expended too much energy back when the monsters were attacking the castle. Moreover, the monster's strange magic further reduced his combat power, such that he could only muster 40 to 50% of his original ability. Taking on the monster's repeated attacks, he had no choice but to hold up the longsword tightly, keeping himself from defeat, while saving as much energy as possible and finding the monster's openings. On the other side of the passageway, Rebecca gathered up her magic and sent out a skull-sized scorching fireball from the front of her staff. The fireball collided in the air with the shadow arrow from the spellcasting monster, causing a shocking explosion. She caught her breath and saw Byron in danger. "The 3 of you, go help Byron!" One of the soldiers hesitated, but Rebecca conjured another ball of fire. "We're fine here. If Byron falls, it'll be over. As Viscountess of House Cecil, I order you, go!" The 3 soldiers had no choice but to obey the order as they went into battle with Sir Byron against the terrifying monster. Gawain held his own in the meantime. The memories and experiences that did not belong to him rapidly became his own, improving his control over his new body. Endless slashes sent the monster reeling back as Gawain got accustomed to its movements too. The monstrous aberration covered in flowing mud was not invulnerable. It could still get injured when cut, and it would die when it got cut up too much. Though they were powerful and had a physical advantage, with the right method, the human body could still destroy them. Gawain knew this from experience 700 years ago. The monster's claws passed over his head. Gawain ducked, and with a counter, he sent the sword piercing into the sludgy thigh. The monster let out a murky howl, and its body fell uncontrollably to the side. Taking this chance, Gawain shouted to Byron, "Try to attack their abdomen and lower limbs. Forget the chest, these things have no heart." Without hesitation, he darted behind the monster, raised his longsword and pierced it into the monster's back. With advice from the Lord Ancestor, Byron's spirit rose. With the help of the 3 soldiers, he quickly restrained the second monster's movements. He grimaced as the monster's claw pierced through his shoulder armor, but went under the monster's sludge-like and struck it in its vital part. After dealing with the enemy, Gawain immediately looked up. He saw a shadow arrow collide with Rebecca's fireball. But just before he could rush toward the last monster, it let out a mournful howl and began spasming as it melted to the ground. Amber appeared behind the monster, steel daggers in each hand tempered with poison. "I'm quite skilled at sneaking up and stabbing the ass." Rebecca put down her staff, exhausted after the repeated spellcasting. After catching her breath, she looked at Amber. "Lord Ancestor said the lower back, not the arse." Amber spun the daggers in 2 quick circles and stored them behind her back. She stepped over the monster's carcass and pouted as she walked over to them. "Tch, you have no sense of humor." As the monsters took their last breath, their mud-like body hardened into crust and disintegrated. All that remained were the contorted red bones underneath. Gawain watched the decaying process with disgust. "So it was these things that attacked us." Heidi glanced at him curiously. "Lord Ancestor, do you know where these monsters came from?" She recalled the advice he had given Sir Byron on how to fight the monsters. Gawain nodded curtly. "The passageways contain spirit-subduing stones that suppress these monsters, but we may still encounter them if we stay here. We need to keep moving." After walking some distance through the ancient underground passageway, Gawain broke the silence. "I did fight these creatures 700 years ago. You should know about the history of the collapse of the Gondolian Empire and the Second Settlement, right?" Rebecca smiled faintly. This history could be said to be a compulsory syllabus for children of nobility. More than 700 years ago, the Lauren continent had only one human nation, and that was the Gondolian Empire, located in the center of the continent. It was the most powerful empire on the continent at that time. Even the Silver Empire built by the elves in the southern part of the continent didn't dare to become its enemy. However, a disturbance in the Sea of Ether caused a catastrophe called the Dark Wave. It broke out right in the land of Gondolian. In the span of a single night, the capital of the Gondolian Empire and a third of the empire was swallowed up by the Dark Wave and disintegrated by the surging elemental power. Gawain shook his head. "It wasn't overnight. The Dark Wave lasted for nearly a month. The palace mages of Gondolian tried everything against the catastrophe, but continue." Rebecca went red. After that, the deadly tide spread out from the Gondolian Empire and eventually decimated the entire continent. That was how the Gondolian Empire fell. After that, as the Sea of Ether gradually calmed down, the Dark Wave became less powerful, and the survivors of Gondolian began to rebuild civilization. As the central area of the continent had turned into a wasteland, it was no longer suitable for humans to live. Thus, with the leadership of a group of heroes, humanity ventured in 4 directions, north, south, east, and west, to leave the ruined empire. This was called the Second Settlement. "Lord Ancestor, you were one of the heroes of that time, were you not?" Gawain smiled. "Indeed I was. The ruins of the Gondolian Empire at the center of the continent sired endless hordes of monsters that emerged from the Dark Wave. Those monsters were one of the biggest threats that humans faced during the Second Settlement." Heidi's eyes widened. "You mean—" Gawain's smile disappeared. His face darkened. "Yes, those monsters are the ones we fought just now." Memories of 700 years ago plagued him. History may call the second settlement a journey of pioneering, but in reality, it was more like an escape. Even after we departed from the ruins of the empire and established a new country along the borders of Lorraine, the monsters continued to pour out from the center, from the ruins of the old empire. In the 10 years after the Anzu kingdom was founded, I dealt with them almost every single day. Rebecca leaned in, absorbing Gawain's every word. What happened after those 10 years? Did you manage to vanquish the monsters? Gawain chuckled. He ruffled the young girl's hair. Silly child, after 10 years of fighting them, I died. Humanity lost against the monsters. I lost. Rebecca's spirits sank. Right, Gawain chuckled. He found it amusing that a spellcaster capable of conjuring giant fireballs could fail to make such a logical leap. Perhaps it was the failure of the current age's compulsory education for aristocratic children. Gawain cast aside thoughts of this world's infrastructure. There were obviously bigger problems. He turned to Dame Heidi. Judging by the way the monsters have ravaged the Cecil territory, I presume we haven't encountered them over these hundreds of years, is that correct? The dame nodded lightly. As it's written in history, the Sentinel Towers built with the help of the elves brought safety and peace to the Anzu kingdom. These monsters have since been relegated to stories and legends. Gawain frowned slightly. Elven buildings can't have failed so easily. Rebecca clenched her fist. We must report this to the king. The monsters that disappeared without a trace hundreds of years ago have suddenly reappeared within the kingdom. The Cecil territory has suffered heavy losses from this unforeseen disaster. We must seek help from the royal family. Gawain thought back to his glorious achievements of old. He smiled with confidence. Fret not, child. With the honourable standing of the Cecil clan, the capital of St. Soniel will spare no effort in helping us rebuild. Heidi and Rebecca fell silent. Gawain noticed the odd expressions that came over their faces. He cocked his head quizzically. What is it? Heidi looked unusually grim. She looked as though she was going to say something when a shadow arrow whizzed by. Gawain stepped in and slashed at the arrow before it could find Heidi. In the darkness, the same monster appeared, 3 meters tall and made of sludge. It reeked of death and charged towards them without any semblance of emotion. Gawain stepped forward to meet the challenge. He figured he needed the practice if he was to continue to pretend to be this hero of old. He hacked down the monster and watched as it disintegrated. The party remained vigilant as they navigated the catacombs. At any hint of danger, any slightest sound of monsters, they stopped and readied to attack. It seemed, however, that the spirit subduing stones did their work to ward the monsters away. Gawain glanced over to Heidi. So what is it? After biting her lip several times, Heidi finally made up her mind. Back in the tomb, I wanted to tell you something, but I couldn't quite put it into words. Gawain had vaguely anticipated what she was going to say, but he still nodded. Go on, I'm listening. Heidi took a deep breath. The reputation of House Cecil is not like it was before. Of course, you are still the legendary Grand Duke who helped found the Anzu kingdom, but... Heidi looked at Rebecca. The current inheritor of the Cecil clan is Rebecca, and within the Anzu kingdom she is only a viscountess. Only the Cecil territory remains of our clan, and after this monster invasion... Heidi forced herself to stop speaking. Gawain stood there dumbstruck. What are you talking about? The king assured me that my dukedom could be inherited as long as my lineage lived on. And what of the plains of the Holy Spirits? Our land used to span all the way there. What happened to House Cecil? Heidi lowered her head in shame. Today, the Anzu kingdom is no longer in its first dynasty, but its second. Our family no longer plays a major role in advising the royal family. Rebecca also lowered her head. 100 years ago, the last king of the first dynasty of Anzu, Dalian III, died from a sudden illness. Crucially, he died without a named heir. The cracks within the royal family burst as a dispute broke out about succession. The empress and chancellors failed to suppress the chaos, and it led to what we now call the turmoil in the month of mist. Gawain felt his hands shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't him, but his body moving on its own. Heidi bowed apologetically. I apologize, Lord Ancestor. It was the year 635 of the Anzu calendar. The dispute within the royal court spread into a civil war across the kingdom. At the center of it was Grumman Cecil, the Grand Duke of the time. Gawain raised an eyebrow. The descendant who took my shield? Rebecca nodded. Marquis Grumman was not yet the Grand Duke. His father was of old age but still very healthy. But because their relationship was strained, the Marquis secretly rallied behind a prince in the civil war in hopes of ensuring he would become the Grand Duke in the new dynasty. But he needed to rally the rest of the clan, so he took your sacred shield and announced his support for Prince Tosh. A month later, Prince Tosh was assassinated in the war. Marquis Grumman quickly announced support for Prince Fiddick. But within a month, the prince lost in battle and killed himself. Gawain placed his hand over his face. This imbecile! Heidi sighed. Marquis Grumman would side with a final successor, the uncle of the former king. He formed a strong alliance and victory seemed to be finally in sight. But out of nowhere, Boulon Wilder, the Grand Duke of the North, announced his support for a young boy. The Grand Duke of the North had not intervened all this time, but now he claims this boy was the true son of the king. With his forces, the civil war effectively ended. Marquis Grumman tried to pledge allegiance to this new king, but by then, Gawain interrupted. Everyone knew that he was a sham, nothing but a bootlicker. Rebecca bit her lip, filled with shame. My grandfather was killed by both his enemies and his allies, and the second dynasty of the Anzu kingdom began. Though of course calling it the second dynasty is a sensitive topic to this day. Amber chirped up. Many in the Cecil clan still call it the Bastard War. In private circles, of course. The Cecils were not the only house to play kingmaker. This is all part and parcel of aristocracy after all. But because the kingdom was in extreme chaos with the new king, order needed to be reinstated, and that meant pinning all the blame on a single clan. Gawain felt like he could combust. The Cecil clan! He experienced vertigo as he learned of the history of the Cecil clan. A single moronic descendant had thrown away all his efforts from 700 years ago. The group walked through the passageway for some time in a tense silence. Rebecca worked up an encouraging smile. Because of you and your reputation, Lord Ancestor, the Cecil clan did not completely fall. Our family's legacy still exists, even if we are no longer in the good graces of the royal family. It was hardly any consolation for Gawain, but it was consolation nevertheless. He stared ahead as he walked. A part of him could understand Grumman Cecil's desperate lust for power to the extent that he sided with just about anyone to get it. But at the end of the day, it was dishonorable. It was petty and cowardly. Gawain shook his head. To think that my lineage would sire such an embarrassment to the land. I could crawl back into my coffin. This imbecile stole my shield too. Heidi and Rebecca kept quiet. It was a surreal experience hearing their ancestor of 700 years scold their grandfather. After some walking, Gawain let out a loud sigh. Forget it. Pursuing these matters of the past is not going to help our present situation. In any case, these monsters that have reappeared are a huge threat to humanity. The king may pay no attention to the Cecil clan, but he can't ignore those monsters. Thus, he must give us the attention as survivors of this attack. More importantly, I am Gawain Cecil, and if I want an audience with the king, I will get it. Heidi nodded vigorously, momentarily touched by her ancestor's level-headedness. After that, Gawain had lost interest in chatting. The dim and cramped underground passageway had eroded his desire to talk, lest he learn more embarrassing truths about his descendants. They picked up their speed and soon reached the exit. With the Earth Elemental's blessing, the ancient stairs in the passageway showed no signs of decay. After removing some roots, vines and soil that were blocking the exit, the fresh breeze caressed their faces. They each let out a gasp of delight. Freedom was in their grasp. Sir Byron led the soldiers out of the hole first. After they sent a signal that it was safe, the others followed after. Rebecca breathed a gulp of fresh air immediately after climbing up to the surface, and she exclaimed cheerfully, "We're out!" Gawain followed after Rebecca. He looked up at the night sky, at the vast new world around him. A sliver of sunlight appeared on the horizon. The approaching dawn caused the starlight to dim. He used to look for constellations, but these stars were all foreign to him, a messy spread across the brightening sky. The white light on the horizon was getting brighter. The escapees from the underground tunnel were all soaked in the approaching sunlight. Gawain opened his arms as if to embrace the sun of this new world. The giant arc of light emerged higher from the horizon. He squinted and frowned as the curved surface lit the world with its brilliance. It continued to rise. Gawain backed away, fearful now. This was not the sun. It was too big to be the sun. Gawain's heart raced. Sweat beaded on his skin. His eyes stung, and yet he couldn't look away. His gaze was immovably fixed upon the horizon. He didn't know what he was looking at. All he could tell was that it was a far cry from the sun he had known. The broad and magnificent arc continued to rise. Its initial ascent was faster than the sun he had known on Earth. Gawain thus could observe a small fraction of the cambered surface. It was indeed emanating light, with edges of blurry and hazy colour, as though they were made of clouds and mist. He supposed that the light and heat of this world were provided by this object. He also realized that staring at the sun for this long would hurt his eyes, but his eyes felt no overt strain upon them. Not only could Gawain stare right at the cosmic spheroid's curved surface, but he could also make out some fine lines on the arc itself. After gauging the arc of the thing, Gawain realized that he was staring at something that was tens, if not hundreds, of times bigger than the sun. If it continued to rise at this distance, Gawain suspected it could very well shroud 1/5 of the entire sky. He didn't know how much of this was warped by his awe of seeing an alien sunrise for the first time, so he figured he would have to wait and see. Looking at the rising orb, Gawain felt tiny, oppressed somehow, as if the sun was a looming god, pressing its thumb down upon this little world. A sense of dread and awe filled him, unlike any he had felt in his previous life. A quick search of Gawain Cecil's memory unsurprisingly turned up countless sunrises that were equally majestic. This phenomenon in the sky was not something extraordinary, but the most normal occurrence in this world. Gawain began to analyze the scene scientifically. Perhaps the physics of this world differed from his home planet. After all, if this celestial body were even half as powerful as the sun, then the entire planet would be a scorched wasteland. This planet was probably very close to the star, in order for it to appear so large. It could be something magical, perhaps, that would explain the lack of an apocalyptic incineration. What seemed to be more likely, however, would be that the planet he stood on was not orbiting around the sun, but a gas giant. That would mean that it was not a planet at all, but a satellite of the latter, and the thing that rose in the sky was the parent planet of this satellite. With these ideas creeping over his head, Gawain felt more like an alien than he ever had. "Ancestor? My Lord Gawain?" Heidi's voice rang out beside him, surprising Gawain from his deep thoughts. "Yes?" Gawain came to his senses instantly, looking at his number of great-great-granddaughters by his side. The beautiful aristocratic woman, having escaped the dark tunnel and the underground crisis, recovered a little of her former countenance. She bowed ever so slightly to Gawain. "I apologize for interrupting your reverie, but we need to find safety." Gawain blinked and for the first time beheld his surroundings. He had been so occupied with the sunrise that he forgot to observe the land around him. The tunnel had led their group to a peaceful-looking hillside, dotted with large boulders. Gawain nodded and slipped back into character. "No defences. We shouldn't linger here. Come. Let's find high ground and survey the surrounding area. I need to know how much this terrain has changed in 700 years. Thus, under the direction of Gawain, the party advanced up the hills a little. On the way, Gawain could not help but look up at the large celestial body several times. Rebecca noticed. "Lord Ancestor, you've been staring at the sun. Is something the matter?" The half-elf Amber, who was walking alongside Rebecca, laughed. "Your ancestor hasn't seen the light of day for 700 years. It's obviously natural that he'd want to look at the sun a few more times than normal." Gawain ignored Amber. Glancing at his one more great than his other great-great-granddaughter, he shook his head slightly. "So they call this the sun here too. Good to know. Or rather, no matter what language it was spoken in, The word referred to the sun and nothing else in the minds of the people here. Gawain searched through the memory of the original owner of the body again. After several attempts with some keywords and receiving vague information, he finally lifted his head with some understanding, gazing across the part of the sky that was still slightly dimmed. In the still unlit part of the sky that still showed its many stars, he spotted a star that was about the size of a grain that was brighter than the others. The people of this world labelled that special star as Ao, and attributed many religious and symbolic meanings. Gawain nodded. Then the sun of this world was a gas giant, and they lived upon a satellite. Ao was then the star of this solar system. It was unbelievably far away that the light it shone on Gawain was practically as cold as any other star. As they were blown by the cool morning breeze, Gawain and his companions arrived at the summit of the hill. They all gasped at the sight before them. In the distance was a mysteriously scarred land that had been razed to the ground by the flames of war. The land was dry and desiccated, like skin splashed by acid. Nothing was left but a vast expanse of rock and soil charred black, with large cracks shot crookedly all over the earth. The vegetation on the ground had long been putrefied, the remaining trunks twisted like claws of demons. Further on, they could see the ruins of collapsed walls, razed homes. A silhouette of a castle sat in the distance, smoke billowing from its wreckage. Giant-like aberrations roamed the devastated soil. The fields and crops had long since been buried indistinguishably in the waves of monsters that ravaged their land. Rebecca gripped her staff, her knuckles whitening. She collapsed to her knees, anger rolling off of her in waves. Clan Cecil's territory? Her eyes were rimmed with red, and tears from fury and sorrow battled within. For once, Heidi didn't dismiss her niece's feelings. Instead, she strode up and put a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. Gawain took no notice, as he was busy looking at the desolation before them. He sighed. This is what the land looks like after it has been ruined by monsters. The Gondolian Empire back then was devastated like this within and without. I predicted that the decay would have remained in the wasteland of the old empire. Instead, new decay appeared in the realm of civilization again. Amber broke out in cold sweat. By the god of shadows, we've been surrounded by those things. Heidi's hand gripped Rebecca's shoulder even harder. Can the clan be saved? Gawain shook his head. You didn't successfully block the advance of the monsters. They have already formed group resonance, and the elemental contamination caused by the demonic tide is irreversible. Even if all of the aberrations are destroyed, the pollution entrenched in the land will remain for quite a long while. Heidi swallowed uncomfortably. How long will it last? Gawain shrugged. Has civilization returned to the Empire of Gondolia? Heidi blinked in confusion. It is still devoid of life. No one dares to tread on the land on the other side of the Great Barrier. Gawain nodded. Then it looks like the decay of the Cecil territory would continue for at least 700 years as well. Rebecca and Heidi stared at Gawain, their jaws hanging open. Even Sir Byron in the back looked upon Gawain with a shocked expression. Gawain felt their eyes burning into him. He looked back, puzzled. Rebecca stood. Lord Ancestor, are you not angry? This is the last of our clan's land. Gawain swore to himself. He knew immediately that he had made another mistake. He was not fully immersed in the role he was supposed to play and had tripped up. He hastily put on a straight face and conjured all of his acting skills. Dwelling on such things is of no use. Gawain Cecil is a pioneer, and every inch of family land and wealth was built from scratch by me. If the land is gone, it's gone. At worst, we can always find new land to settle on. What's the use of brooding over a defeat? Heidi and Rebecca nodded hurriedly. Gawain sighed in relief. He needed to be more careful, because he couldn't keep covering for his mistakes like this without arousing some sort of suspicion. There's nothing else to see here. The next thing we have to do is plan our itinerary. The first thing to do now is to find a town and convene with the people who broke out. I remember you mentioning a Sir Philip breaking out with a group of people. Do you have an agreed-upon meeting place? Rebecca answered quickly. We plan to meet at Tanzan town up north. If Tanzan was also attacked by the monsters, they would continue north along King's Road. Gawain nodded. and was about to set off when a strange feeling made him stop in his steps. After a moment of pause, he and Sir Byron shouted out, "Duck! Hide!" Even though they did not know why, Rebecca and Heidi still fled with Sir Byron to the protection under a large rock nearby. Amber had already vanished into some cranny of darkness the moment Gawain opened his mouth. Gawain himself took cover behind Rebecca. However, he noticed that the lost little maid Betty was still grasping onto her saucepan with a blank expression and darted out to pull her back. Just as soon as they darted under the rock, a great shadow fell upon them. In the rising brilliance of the great sun, an elegant and enormous creature sailed across the sky slowly. It was a deep blue dragon that spanned over 30 feet in length. Sitting under a rock, Heidi yelped in fear and moved her fingers quickly, as if weaving on an invisible loom. Blue light crackled from her hands, then everyone flickered and vanished. Gawain gasped. Before he could inquire what was going on, he heard a voice in his ear. It was Heidi. "Position distortion spell. I don't know if it'll work on such a creature, but it's the only chance we have." As luck would have it, the humongous dragon did not notice the people on the ground, or maybe just disdained to notice them. He or she only flapped their wings languidly, sweeping across the sky with grace and majesty, its eyes reflecting the Cecil territory that had been ruined by the dark wave. The giant beast reared its lizard-like head back. An orange glow appeared in its mouth, and then it let out a plume of flame down upon Clan Cecil's land. Dragons. Gawain, Rebecca, Heidi, Betty the maid, Sir Byron and their soldiers crouched underneath rocks. They remained as still as possible, while staring up in equal parts awe and fear of the dragon. Gawain had never seen one on Earth, but he remembered glimpsing one between his lives. He quickly scoured the memory of the first Gawain to see if he had known anything about these beasts. Such creatures had not been sighted in the mortal world in ages. In fact, to the intelligent beings that inhabited the continent of Lorraine, dragons were considered to be a beast that existed between the planes of legend and reality. Granted, they were certain that this powerful creature existed, yet very few had actually seen a real one in their lifetime. The only exception was the secretive and longevous elves who lived in the south. Their long lives made them excel at being historical witnesses, and in the lengthy history of the Elven Empire, their chronicles only detailed 1 or 2 encounters with dragons. The elegant but powerful creature with its deep blue scales and humongous wings flew across the sky as it breathed lethal fire below. The flames were so hot that they burned white, scouring the land that once belonged to Clan Cecil below. Where the column of fire swept, the ground burned and the fire spread even without needing any fuel. With a few hot puffs from the dragon, the entire land was completely engulfed in an inferno. After completing its deed, the majestic beast circled around the area for a while, as though inspecting its work, before beating its wings and flying upwards, disappearing into the slowly brightening clouds. Gawain heard a few deep exhales nearby. All of his companions had been holding their breath for fear that even the slightest movement would have brought that hellfire down upon them too. Rebecca gripped her staff, her complexion pale as a ghost. She quivered with panic flowing through her veins. "Dragons, dragons, ancestor, I saw a dragon!" Gawain cleared his throat. "Worry not, I saw it too." At Gawain's words, Rebecca froze. She flushed ever so slightly, embarrassed to have pointed out the obvious. She looked away awkwardly. Heidi stepped out from under the rocks and looked toward the scene they had beheld before. She gasped. Gawain followed, curious to see what further damage the dragon had wrought. Where before the land had been ravaged by monsters, now nothing remained but a blasted heath, all life extinguished by white-hot fire. Even the monsters that had been roaming around before were gone, blasted to ash. Sir Byron let out an impressed whistle. "I thought dragons were a thing of legends." Gawain had a look over it. The usually strict and stoic knight was transfixed by the desolation before them. "My lord, have you met a dragon before?" Gawain shook his head. Dragons are a really mysterious breed. Even when half of Lorien had been turned upside down 700 years ago, they never interfered in worldly matters. Even as he relayed the truth of the previous Gawain's memory, This current Gawain was far from surprised. After all, he had glimpsed a dragon when he was flying through the sky, before his return to life. At this moment, the shadow beside Gawain suddenly shivered twice. He turned around to look, and sure enough, Amber was standing behind him, her elven face frozen in astonishment. "I've seen a dragon! My mum will never believe this. I've seen a dragon, and that one was huge." All right, we all saw it." Gawain glared at the suddenly loud thief. "Where did you go earlier?" Amber grinned mischievously. "Inside the crack of a nearby rock. Go on, you don't have to say it. My escape skills are the best you've ever seen." Gawain held his forehead and sighed. "You can hide well enough, but you can't sneak around every problem." Amber frowned and cocked her head at him. "Why not?" Gawain groaned and shook his head. This conversation was a waste of time. "Come now, we cannot stay here. Let's go." With that, Gawain started to walk down the hill. Even though the dragon had already left, heavens knew what other strange things would materialize, making leaving this place as soon as possible the topmost priority. Some of them followed right away, but Dame Heidi lingered behind. "Ancestor, the dragon burned our homeland." Gawain looked over his shoulder at her. "No, it didn't. It only razed the ruins of our homeland." The dame bit her lip, emotion swirling underneath her composed features. Gawain sensed that this assurance was not enough to get to her. He walked back up the hill and took her arm. Dame Heidi flinched but didn't pull away. Gawain looked her straight in the eyes. The dragon wasn't targeting our home. It was burning the monsters. We cannot seek vengeance for a land that was already ruined. Be practical, Heidi. The next thing to do is to get back to civilization. Then we can alert everyone about the monsters. Heidi nodded, her voice too far away to make a reply. Gawain released Heidi's arm and turned to go. The others reluctantly followed him. Gawain sighed as he kept walking. He understood how they felt, even though he wasn't the real Gawain Cecil. Having one's homeland desecrated, even after it had been destroyed, was heartbreaking. He didn't feel heartbroken himself, so he decided it was best to be the decisive one, as his experience wasn't clouded with nostalgia. With mixed emotions, the band left this area. They strode down the hill in a sort of trance, eventually stopping before a densely wooded forest. No matter how hard any of them peered into the trees, they couldn't penetrate the woods. With staff raised in one hand, Dame Heidi traced her finger through the air. A blue line of glistening light followed her digits as she drew several runes in the air. The mage stared at them for several moments and nodded. She then gestured with her staff towards the dense forest. "We can only reach the main road through this forest. That's the only way we'll be able to reach Tanzan." Gawain felt a twinge of envy at Dame Heidi's magical prowess. So far, all this new body had been able to do was fight with a sword, whereas Heidi's magic was something truly exciting, useful, and unknowable. Heidi cocked her head at Gawain. The glowing runes vanished. "Ancestor, have I displeased you with my magic?" Gawain blinked and shook his head. He laughed to distract from his confusion. "Why would I be displeased?" Heidi averted her eyes slightly. Cecil clan was founded on chivalry, knighthood, and martial arts, as you well know. Yet Rebecca and I are mages. 100 years ago, choosing to follow magic instead of warfare would have led to us being ostracized from the clan. Gawain chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Who came up with such a silly rule?" The others froze. Everyone looked away somewhat awkwardly. Sir Byron pretended to tie his shoelaces even though he was wearing metal boots. Heidi froze like a scared turkey, and Rebecca found the nearby trees very interesting all of a sudden. Gawain winced. "Oh!" Another memory flashed before his eyes. All of a sudden he was not in the midst of a forest, but in a tavern in the heart of the Anzu kingdom. Next to him was another young man in old-fashioned armor. They were laughing in triumph together. "You have done it, Gawain!" His friend's cheeks were red and his eyes unfocused, but his smile was infectious. Gawain felt his own mouth smile, and felt his lips form a reply. "No, we have done it. One day you'll be known as Charles I." His friend Charles laughed this off. "Nay, I refuse to be called Charles I. He waited for a comically long moment. Charlie the First will be fine. The two doubled over in their mirth, and the context of this celebration filtered through Gawain's recollection. These two were celebrating their establishment of a new kingdom, the Anzu kingdom. Charlie held up his mug to the knights surrounding them, all of whom were just as drunk as he. A toast? Wait, you lugs, I haven't said to what yet. Charlie paused for a moment. Gawain, what should we toast to? Gawain stood and thrust his own tankard to be alongside Charlie's. A toast to knights! Everyone cheered. Gawain continued. You all made this kingdom happen, therefore. On this day I decree knights are better than mages. Charles threw his arm over his friend. Yes, Gawain speaks the truth. The two of them kept laughing as the memory faded into blackness. Back in the modern day, Gawain grimaced. He cast an awkward glance at both Heidi and Rebecca. It was now Gawain's turn to look away embarrassed. I was drunk when I made that rule. Let's just pretend it never happened. Just then, Gawain's awkward moment was interrupted by a telltale grumbling. All eyes turned toward Amber. The half-elf was holding her belly. She shrugged impishly. Hate to interrupt your family bonding, but I'm kinda hungry. As if on cue, everyone else's stomach growled, even Gawain's. It was only then that Gawain realized everyone had not eaten for a long time ever since they had surfaced from that darkened crypt. Also, he had gone without food for a way longer period of time than anyone else. The last time he had the pleasure of a full meal, the monkeys on Lauren had not even begun to walk upright. Facing monsters felt like an easy game, especially when the other option was starving to death at the edge of a forest.